The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. Allison, interesting developments with Thomas Ashe Mellon this week. He crossed the border to pay a visit to some people in Portlaoise prison, and later in the day he was arrested by PSNI officers in forensic suits and brought before the courts. So what's happening?
It was actually in the news several days before that, because what happens is Thomas Ashe Mellon is believed to be, or widely believed to be, the leader of the new IRA up in the north. And he is subject to an anti-terror law. He was actually, I think, one of the first people in Northern Ireland to be given one of these. It's like an anti-terror restriction, which means he can't leave the UK jurisdiction without the permission of the police. He had applied to cross the border. He was going to meet with Eamon, the TD, and he was to visit prisoners in Portlaoise, and that was refused by the PSNI, and then he went to court, and a judge then granted permission, and the court was told that this was to do specifically with issues surrounding Republican prisoners, as well as being a member of SURA, which is like the sort of political wing of the new IRA. He is also a member of the Irish Republican Prisoners Welfare Association, which is the prisoners group which specifically looks after new IRA prisoners in prisons both north and south. They would collect money, and they would give money to their families at Christmas and things like this. So that's another one of his roles. So that's what the judge was told. Mm-hmm. And he was allowed then to travel across the border. Now, within, I suppose, minutes of him being stopped on the way back across the border, I was receiving pictures of him standing at the side of the road, dressed in this. The PSNIs, a few times I've seen this happening, when they're pulling people in, suspects now, who they believe or they're questioning in relation to terrorist allegations, they are covering them in these white paper outfits by the side of the road, and putting their hands into these white paper bags, and they're dressed them in full forensic suits while they're waiting at the side of the road. So Thomas Ashe Mellon pulled in. So what we later found out was that all visitors going in to Portlaoise prison are swabbed. I'm assuming, similar to the airport when you get pulled in for a check and they run the thing around the inside of your suitcase or whatever, that sort of explosive swab, and they come back as positive. And so they weren't permitted to enter the prison. Mm. They went on about their business, I'm assuming, and they went and met with the politician who they were due to meet. And this is where there's a slight bit of confusion, because someone, and we don't know whether it was the guards, we don't know whether it was Portlaoise prison itself, we don't know in what form that took, had contacted the PSNI and alerted them of this development, that these visitors tested positive for potential explosives or firearms residue. And therefore, the cops were waiting on them basically as across the border at Strabane. There was a hard stop, as they call it, which means they literally pull out in front of the car and stopped him on the side of the road. He was arrested and he was taken to Musgrave Serious Crime Suite for questioning, and then was released yesterday without charge. So it's been quite a dramatic few days, given the fact that this was all painted as a nice innocent meeting with prisoners, and then it turned into this sort of cross-border police chase, hard stop, him, at the side of the road in forensic outfits, and he's now being released without charge. It will clearly is something that I would imagine would go against him if he makes any further applications across the border.
I can pick up a little bit from down here and just give you some extra detail on that. So the delegation arrived at Portlaoise prison in the morning, and there was 3 of them, and only one failed the explosives test. Now, Eamon was also due to come in with them, and they were sort of outside making phone calls, and they hung around for a while before they basically left. But they did ask to see the governor and saw him, and seemed to have gone in around lunchtime. So I think the visit actually happened, or certainly they met with the governor. So from a timeline point of view, the visit was due in the morning and that arrest was very much in the evening time, given, travel timings.
I do have a statement from Sura, who then sent a statement through on the evening of the arrest to say that they're saying that the meeting was called to discuss the conditions in Portlaoise Jail and follows on from similar previous meetings. They're saying on arrival, the three, and they're calling them IRPWA, so Irish Republican Prisoners Welfare Association representatives, went to the reception and onto the search area. Upon being swabbed, Thomas Ashe Mellon allegedly gave a positive reading on the explosive substance scanner. The delegation challenged the staff to afford Thomas Ashe a body search if necessary. However, this was declined. And then it said the IRPWA representatives then left the jail without the meeting proceeding. The Garda were not called, nor were any of the delegations questioned on any matter. And so here's them what they're saying. So on leaving the prison, the representatives met with Eamon O'Queeve, and during the course of a brief meeting, the delegation complained about the visit being stopped and raised the issue of planned visits being sabotaged, as they say, for political reasons. So they're saying the issue over the calibration of the search scanner was also raised, as other visitors to Republican prisoners face similar problems. So they're blaming it on the scanner or something else happened. So the meeting with the politician went ahead, the meeting with the prisoners did not. But do we know? I'm not actually sure what prisoners they were trying to meet. Maybe you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, well, the main sort of new IRA prisoners in Portlaoise Jail at the moment would be Kevin Brainey, Edward McGrath, Sharif Kelly and Dean Evans. All of them are serving a life sentence for the murder of Peter Butterley. And this happened in around 2013 from memory, the murder. But at which time this new IRA were under acute Garda surveillance by the Special Detective Unit, and all of them are serving this life sentence. But at the time, during those court cases, during those trials in the Special Criminal Court, Kevin Brainey was described as the leader and the mastermind of that murder and the leader of the grouping at the time. But it seems that Edward McGrath, who's a 37-year-old from Tala, is seen by the prison as the OC of that new IRA grouping. So, look, we don't know exactly what the meeting, what actual conditions they could be complaining about, because I think conditions are pretty good down in Portlaoise. I know they certainly were getting family visits around Christmas, and there were special meals being prepared for them, and they're all held together and have their own wing. So conditions in Portlaoise have always been pretty positive for dissident and Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of obviously Sarah saying, well, how was this information passed on? I don't know what duty of care maybe the prison service would have had to pass that information on. I don't know whether they would have had to tell the guards, and maybe then they told the PSNI. What you would imagine is that Thomas Ashe Mellon, who's already someone who would be pretty monitored in terms of the security and intelligence agencies, given the high profile that he has, that any future applications he makes to try and travel anywhere, this will obviously be brought up in objection to him moving anywhere. And he was then released without charge. Those scanners, I mean, I've been in and out of prisons here in Northern Ireland in terms of my work and getting to visit prisoners or whatever, and you don't get scanned for explosives. You have to go through like a metal detector and all sorts of other things, but I've never been scanned for explosives in a prison. I think in Portlaoise,
every visitor has to be scanned. It's the highest security prison in the country. And I suppose let's just go back briefly to the foundation of the new IRA, which is in 2012, and it sort of is an alliance of former members of the real IRA, that Derry-based Republican Action Against Drugs, and some sort of older former provisional IRA members who are disagreeing with the peace process, and they sort of align themselves to this new grouping. Now, what had happened here in Dublin, all centred on Alan Ryan and Aidan O'Driscoll and their activities. They were the real IRA leaders here in the south, effectively. They'd both been locked up in Portlaoise prison in 2005. and served a sentence. Now, when they got out, they declared a sort of a war on drugs down in the south, and they claimed they were taking money and weapons from drug dealers and that they were sort of policing disadvantaged areas and communities. But the reality was, of course, that they were running extortion rackets against some of the organised crime gangs. Now, there was a series of murders in 2010. There was 3 murders. There was a drug dealer in Cork, Gerard Staunton. There was Colm Colliones in Dublin, and also Sean Winters. They claimed those 3 murders. Owens and Winters certainly were linked to the drug dealer and gang leader Eamon the Don Dunn. In 2011, they had a bigger scalp in the guise of Michael Micah Kelly, who was at that point in a relationship with Kiva Robinson, who goes on to marry Daniel Kinahan. He had refused to hand up any of his money to them, and they had taken him out, which was a very sort of a courageous move on their part, and I think one which changed the mindset of the drug dealers down south. They decided they weren't going to put up with this any longer, and Ryan was himself murdered. And indeed, O'Driscoll was also murdered. It caused chaos within the group. There was court cases going on as well in the Special Criminal Court, which were showing that members of the organisation were not only extorting drug dealers, but they were extorting business people as well. And I think there was this sort of decision that organised crime would fight back. And obviously then we see the coming together of these groupings into the new IRA. Yep. Now, maybe similar happened in the north.
Well, I do know from around that time. So what happened, as you said, there was a group called Republican Action Against Drugs, which were basically just vigilantes who were, kneecapping people who they were accused of involving criminality and drugs in and around the northwest Derry Strabane area. They wouldn't have been particularly heavily armed, and they, at several occasions, said that they were of no threat to the state, if you like. They weren't targeting police officers or prison officers. That all then changed, obviously, with this merger group. So there was a real attempt at this point in time to form a sort of super group, a group that they believed it was going to rival the provisional IRA. And there was a guy, Tony Catney, TC as he was known. TC is now dead. He died of cancer. He was trying to get this sort of super Republican armed group together. And for that, he tried to bring in the Continuity IRA. He tried to bring in the group Oglan Ahern, who were probably the most active at that time. He managed to get, as you said, these independent Republicans who were mainly from the Tyrone area. They were heavily armed. These were people who withheld a lot of weapons back for their own use from decommissioning. And they were also people who would be involved in that smuggling world, sort of fuel, cigarette smuggling, which also give them access to weapons. So they were quite heavily armed. And there was a few, and then the real IRA and what was left with the real IRA came on as well. Oglan Ahern and the Continuity IRA near the end of this expressed concerns about what was going on, and they withdrew from it. So they weren't part of the merger, and it would later seem that was a wise decision, because Tony Catney's best friend, his right-hand man, the person he was seen with quite a lot at this time, who was bringing to meetings with him, is a guy called Dennis McFadden, who we have spoke about before, who it turns out was an MI5 agent and had been there at the infiltration and the formation of this organisation, and had spent 10 years at the heart of this organisation spying on its members. So that is how they came around. I do know around the Alan Ryan time, and I remember speaking to Republicans, and bear in mind that the new IRA at the time had some very senior ex-provisionals, people who would have been considered big hitters, bomb makers, people who would have been quite easily have caused chaos. There were ex-prisoners, ex-blanket men. There was people like that involved. Now that all fell away fairly soon, but there were people like that involved at the start, and I know that they went en masse down to Alan Ryan's funeral. And I remember speaking to some of them when they came back, and they were horrified by what they had seen, because these were people who were committed lifelong Republicans in, I suppose, the traditional armed Republican sense. And regardless of whatever you think about the justification or morality of that, they weren't people who were making money from their involvement in Republicanism. There were people who were sort of purists, I suppose, in terms of what they believed armed struggle was around. They arrived down in Dublin to what I was told was an organisation that looked more like the UDA Spice Boys of the 1990s, early 2000s. The boys with the Range Rovers and the tans and the muscles and the gold chains and the T-shirts 2 sizes too small, and the designer clothes. and, the glamorous girlfriends and everything else that went along with that. And they were like, what the hell is this? This isn't anything like what we expected. This is clearly, a vigilante group intent on self-interest and self-promotion and also self-finance. And, there's no, you wouldn't have seen too many Republicans of that tradition driving around in fancy cars in Northern Ireland. Just wouldn't happen. Do you know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, boys who look more like, the Essex boys gangsters of the 90s and driving around. So there was a lot of disillusionment about what was going on there. They clearly realised that the money that was being sent up the road from the Dublin Rail IRA was not all of the money that the Dublin Rail IRA were making. Quite a bit of that was being held back again. And so there was problems with that. And that all fed into the merger. And the new IRA quite quickly is sort of, I suppose, when you say asserted itself, it made its presence known quite quickly. In terms of their first shooting was a prison officer, a man by the name of David Black, who was on his way to work in Magabry, driving along the motorway, and a car pulled up beside him, wound down the window, and shots were fired out of this car driving at speed. He was killed, and that was basically the sort of announcement of we have arrived of the new IRA. And they were considered then at that stage, they quickly overtook ONH, who later went on to ceasefire, as the most dangerous of the armed organisations, and were involved in the murder of Adrian Ismay, who was a prison officer. They were involved in quite a few different shootings, and more recently, I suppose last year, the attempted murder of DCI John Caldwell in Omagh. But what we're also seeing is they appear to be either heavily infiltrated or the covert surveillance on them is such a point where they are continuously being arrested and caught. So just, not so long ago, a few weeks ago, we had a guy stopped in a car again, white paper suit put on the side of the road, follow-up searches, a automatic rifle was found. I think it's like an AKM, which is one of those Libyan shipment guns that was sent from Gaddafi to the IRA back in the 80s and 90s. One of those was recovered almost straight away. And I'm told that the people who would have been involved in moving that, they weren't that long in the organisation. And it seems that every time they try to do something or move something, they're caught. And that would indicate that despite the fact that Dennis McFadden is now long gone, that there's still infiltration within that organisation. Or it could be that they're just so tightly, covertly monitored that everything they do is being picked up on very, very quickly.
Yeah, well, certainly that seems to be the case down here. And of course, when Kevin Brainey replaced Alan Ryan and Aidan O'Driscoll, he was this sort of new, sort of, I suppose, that more traditional values that you talk about. Certainly he and his mob were not flash. They certainly didn't look like drug dealers, but they continued with the extortion. I mean, they seemed to get support logistically, financially from the north, and with stolen cars and arms dumps, and with safe houses and proceeds of armed robberies. They estimate here that they have 200 supporters, maybe 50 actively involved in criminal activities, which is, I suppose, a policeable number.
Yeah, they wouldn't have that great of numbers in Northern Ireland either. They would have been very active originally. There was quite a big rump of them, as it says, in certain geographical areas. So in the County Armagh, sort of Lurgan area, you'd have had quite a big number. When I say big number, we're talking probably, several dozen members and supporters. Then you'd have had a sort of West North Belfast sort of contingent of the new IRA. But then their main support would have been in Derry. It has dwindled, and I think that, a lot of people are realised after the McFadden stuff that maybe the gig was up and it was time to sort of call it a day and maybe look at other things. And I've had conversations this week with people who would have still been endorsing armed republicanism right up until very recently, and they're saying, we can see a pathway now to United Ireland, albeit it may not be for the next 10 years, but there is a clear pathway there. All this is doing is sending young men to jail, and is there really any purpose to it? And this is, I suppose, the main thing is they've said that it would continue indefinitely if there was public support and appetite for it, and there isn't.
Yeah.
There's not support for this anymore. It does seem like a relic of the past. And now I would say that the new IRA is real, I suppose, the last remaining stronghold that they have would be in and around the Derry Strabane area, and almost quite specific to almost a certain part of Derry and around sort of Craigan. And we see that every time there's searches, and we see young people on the streets and everything. And they can manage to get, several hundred people out at marches or commemorations, but that doesn't mean that there's several hundred members. A lot of this would be people who would be not even supporters. A lot of times it's people just being nosy. Out to watch the parades because it's something to do. You see, young people are attracted to these type of things because it's something to do. But yeah, I mean, I do think that we're probably looking at maybe the end game of the IRA. I mean, I know from speaking to people who recently left that organisation disillusioned with it, that they were advocating from within that, it's now time to look at maybe calling a ceasefire, maybe trying to discuss other ways to do this. The prisons are grown and full of people who, some of them are in the sort of, the second part of their people in their 50s, who are looking at maybe spending the next 15, 16 years in prison and coming out as old men and have achieved, the sum total of nothing really in terms of what has been done.
I think what's notable, and just a case in point down this side of the border, when Seamus McGrain, who was the former leader of the real IRA, was targeted, he was caught trying to plot a bomb attack for the visit of Prince Charles for 2015. And along with him was arrested a guy called Conan Murphy. Now, he was the son of Colin Murphy. Yeah.
I interviewed Conan before, yeah.
And he was kind of caught up in it. And it seems like, he was 30 at that stage, too young to surely be going down this road. And yet sort of, it's almost as if it was a career that was begrudged him because of the peace process. He's that kind of age group, and maybe you see those kind of same dreamers or fantasists, they feel like nowadays.
Well, I remember going down at the time when Conan had been arrested and speaking to Colin Murphy, and he took me and the photographer to, because what had happened is they said that the guards had found this bomb making factory just in a sort of rural location in the outskirts of Dundalk. And he took us to it. And the reason why he took us there is he said this was a decommissioning shed. This is where all of the South Armagh weapons for decommissioning were gathered. And you can still see bits of wire and copper wire and all sorts of other things that were left over from that time. But he said Chaslin visited this shed, and this is where the decommissioning took place. And he took us to it. And honestly, and I'm going off the tangent here, but I weigh in high heel boots because I'm not wise and had no idea where I was being taken, and had to climb over a ladder on a stone wall to get into this shed where these pictures were being taken. And I could see these country boys looking like, who is this woman and why did she come to visit us dressed like this? But anyway, that is me climbing over a ladder in high heels was not the point. But he took us to this decommissioning shed, and I asked then people who would have been connected to the original IRA at the time, and they confirmed that shed had been used for decommission. And this was obviously going to be part of Conan's defence. And then they ended up, I think he took up a plea and did some time in relation to that. But yeah, his father at that time, now we know that Colin Murphy is now dead. Otherwise, I would clearly be worried about telling you that story. But
yes.
But Colin Murphy was linked to all sorts of attacks, including the Oma bomb.
Is it a dream to sort of live that life of the fathers and the grandfathers before them? And, is that a motivation for them to continue this in the modern world?
I think that he'd grown up in that extremely Republican family and probably thought that, it was quite proud, I suppose, of coming from that kind of family. But then, the real IRA, when we look back and we look at people like Mickey McCavitt, the people who then formed the real IRA, there was probably still at that time a sizable chunk of Republicans who were very, very dubious about the motivations in terms of the ceasefire. They certainly weren't in favour of decommissioning. They were really not in favour of signing up to supporting policing arrangements. And all of that, I think, would have took off in a much more dangerous way for our peace process had it not been for the Oma bomb and the horror, the public revulsion that surrounded that. Because, nobody could have looked at that and thought, well, this is a good idea, let's continue on like this. This will... and I think that the Oma bomb was widely accepted as, the end of the real IRA in any real numbers or terms. I know dozens of people left it after that. Then, its leadership then, most of them ended up in prison. Mickey McCavitt ended up in prison. And they had been really heavily armed, because remember, Mickey McCavitt was the quartermaster of the original IRA, and maintained most of his arms dumps and didn't hand them over to be decommissioned. So they could have caused real instability to the peace process. But all of those innocent lives lost at Omagh, I think, just caused such complete and utter horror among not just, in every community, nationalist, Republican, Unionist, there was just complete horror at it. And I think that was when a lot of people who might have been slightly dubious about the path that the peace process was taken was saying, right, well, look, this may be our only option and we'll have to get on board with this. And so that was the real IRA. Wasn't surprised when they merged. That, I suppose, that name and brand, if you want to call it that, was so damaged by Omagh that you could see what Tony Catney was doing when he said, well, let's change it and form. And they tried to then set themselves up as the IRA. They kept briefing journalists, we are the IRA, but nobody called them that. Everybody called them the IRA, but they wanted to be the sort of provisional IRA. But when you think about that, knowing what we know now, I know that Dennis McFadden was instrumental in the setting up of that organisation. If you were MI5 or any of the intelligence agencies, sure, isn't it easier to monitor one big group than dozens of little small fractured groups?
For sure.
And you can see that if there was someone from MI5 at the heart of that and in Tony Catney's ear saying, come on, we'll do this, is a good idea, you can see that from their point of view, it would be much easier to have one distant organisation that they could infiltrate and monitor than have dozens of little fractured ones all over the place.
For sure. Now, finally, Thomas Ashe Mellon, right? So he's a 48-year-old man. Is he a family man? Has he is there younger people under or around him that he has, you speak to some of the older provos and you can understand where they were coming from. They were trying to change the future, the landscape, the aspirations for their children and grandchildren when they were doing what they were doing. But the likes of him, has he got young people around him or a family, or what sort of a guy is he and what motivates him, do you think?
There's mainly only young people around that organisation up in Derry at the minute, and you can see that by the age of the arrest a lot of times of some of the people who've been arrested. And look, there's a number of things, and this is not in any way any justification for anything that's going on, but if you look at deprivation statistics, and if you look at poverty and unemployment statistics, and if you look at what is happening, and then you look at where there is criminality, criminal gangs or paramilitary gangs, well, the two things often are linked, so Derry didn't see the same peace dividend that maybe other parts of Northern Ireland would have after the peace process. And a lot of young people there, I think, do feel a bit despondent in terms of educational achievement and job prospects. And then that makes people easy to be groomed or recruited into those organisations. There are also people that probably have a Republican background in terms of who their grandfathers and fathers were and on that sort of tradition. But also, I do think that there needs to be a real serious conversation that instead of, demonising young people, that there's a real conversation about looking at them and trying to move them in a way that's far more positive and get them away from those sort of armed organisations. And you would like to think that somewhere in the back of the minds of people who are involved in those groups that they realise that that's no future for the young people of their estate. And then there's a problem too, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, there's a problem with policing, because if the police are under threat, which they are under quite considerable threat in Derry, and especially if they go into somewhere like the Creggan, you'll only ever see police that look like police from when I was a child, police in Land Rovers and in those TSG rat uniforms. They don't get to see police officers, in short sleeve shirts, standing around doing normal police work. And then that's all those young people see, and that's not peacetime policing. And nobody would even try and say that was peacetime policing. So it feeds each other. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? So the threat means that then the police look so heavily armed and aggressive and like the aggressors, and then that's all those young people see. And so then they believe, well, they're not my friend, they're the enemy, and then the threat continues. And you can see how all of these things feed into each other, and people are too complacent about that, and they've let it go on for too long. And I find it very frustrating that young people who could be given a better life are quickly demonised, sometimes by the media and sometimes by politicians and sometimes just by being completely let down. And that's not trying to justify anything they're doing, because when you say that, people go, well, I was brought up poor and I didn't do X, Y, and Z. But we're not playing poverty bingo here or Olympics or trying to outdo each other. Just saying there's a fact that, maybe they feel that they have been let down by the peace process and by society and by politics in general. And that's something that other people then who want to continue on that sort of armed republicanism for whatever reason, whether it's for their own self-interest or financial gain, or whether it's just because they genuinely are so, blinkered in terms of politics that they can't see any other way out, well, then those young people would be very easy to recruit, wouldn't they? I mean, when you think about that, their vulnerabilities make them really susceptible.
For sure.
Organizations.
You can absolutely see that, and so easy to put, a pipe bomb in their hands, or, I'm sure it's, that rioting sort of thing is exciting, and there's a grooming effect there. But these new IRA leaders, like, of course, Ashe Mellon, like, what is he trying to do for those young people as opposed to draw them into this world of violence that doesn't seem to be going anywhere in the modern world?
Well, this is what I wonder is, what was that meeting down south all about? What was the actual motivation for that meeting? Was it just about talking about prisoners? Because the fact that a judge granted him permission to go, you would think, would that be the case? You just go, look, send someone else down to talk to Eamon O'Keefe about the prisoners. You're not going anywhere.
And it's hardly about getting the prisoners extra chocolate bars at the weekend. I mean, it's not like as fickle as that.
No. You see, I mean, you wouldn't be getting bail. You're getting changed your conditions for that. So you would wonder, put it this way, if you were a former member of the professional IRA, you'd be a man in your 60s and 70s now. The leadership of the IRA are not that age group. They're people in their 30s and 40s. So they're not people who were, big, operators in terms of, so you think back to the real IRA and the formation of that was disgruntled professional IRA members. That was the Mickey McCavitts, the Colin Murphys and all those sort of people. The Liam Campbells, all of those kind of people. It's not that anymore. It's completely different. It's completely different setup and demographic and even the organisation, or lack of organisation of it. So you would wonder then, looking at that, there's a guy, Gary Donnelly, who would have been a member of that Irish Republican Prisoners Welfare Association. He was a member of the 32 County Sovereignty Movement. He'd seen a lot with Marianne Price and everything in the early days of the real IRA, and he is now an elected councillor. Basically tops the polls, most council elections. And so you'd wonder, are some of them looking at him and going, is this maybe the direction we go? You can still be opposed to maybe a lot of the aspects of Sinn Féin and their political directions, but we can still be involved in politics, and maybe that's the direction. And I'm speculating here, so don't be thinking I'm saying this because I have some great insight into it, but I'm wondering what exactly was Thomas Ashe Mellon doing, crossing the border to meet with the TD, and are we going to see very soon a change of direction from that organisation? It's going to take it into a more political realm, because the Dennis McFadden sting, that MI5 sting, resulted in the alleged leadership of that group all being behind bars for some considerable time. Most of them are bailed now, but they're bailed on very strict bail conditions, and they can't move basically without being watched and having to be inform the authorities. A lot of them are subject to the Thomas Ashe Mellon is obviously subject to this terrorist legislation, which keeps them from crossing the border. Technology has advanced to such a point, it's so easy to monitor people. I mean, to go back to the Dennis McFadden stuff, I've seen MI5 stings in sector and court cases where they've shown footage or played audio of MI5 stings, and usually it's pretty poor quality. But what I do know in terms of the Operation Arbacia case, which is the Dennis McFadden case, that the recordings in that, I was told, it's like going to the cinema and sitting watching something, on a so clear. And that is the advancement of the technology to the point where hard as a little, small group of people like the IRA think that they can continue to operate against the entire might of the British intelligence system, and also a technology that advances on a weekly basis to the point where it's almost impossible for anyone to move without their movements being monitored by those intelligence agencies. And we all know, if I leave the house now, there'd be some kind of GPS on my phone and my car and everything else. They'll say where I am. It's almost impossible to move anywhere without being monitored. And surely they must take that into consideration at some point.
Well, look, let's hope they're taking into consideration all those factors we've spoken about. And
my daughter was here, she was here yesterday. She was up from Armagh, and I was talking to her, and her life is so different from mine and full of, joy and privilege and hope and excitement and all sorts of other things. And that is what the peace process was meant to bring. And it has delivered for her. And I'd like to see it delivering in terms of art delivers for other people's children, because I can't think that anyone would want that for their kids, to go back to those days. It's to me, it's just such a horrible memories of such a horrible time and living in a militarized environment. And I don't want it for my children or grandchildren. And I'm pretty sure that the majority of the people, living in the Craiglang and Derry don't want it for their children and grandchildren either.
For sure. Allison Morris, thank you very much. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.